Hello, everybody. I'm Zeus Caravallo from ZK Research, and I'm here for another ZKast video session with my good friend Mark Reed Edwards. As always, ZKast is brought to you by my media partner eWEEK, and so this is part of the eSpeaks product as well. So, Mark, it looks like we've been. It looks like kind of the event season is coming back, albeit digital. But we had Ignite this week. There's a couple of other big events coming up. So, where do you want to start with this?
Well, how about Nvidia's GPU Technology Conference? A fascinating company, and I bet this is going to be a really interesting conference.
Yeah, they announced this week that GTC, which is GPU Technology Conference, will actually be held April 12th to 16th in an all-digital format. I missed the show. I like the live version of it. I suppose we'll be back to these sometimes. What's been interesting to watch about GTC is a few years ago, this was a show that was focused on developers primarily and gamers, right, as a secondary audience. And it has become really a major kind of AI show that's centered around silicon, albeit, but they still have a lot of good use cases. And it's become more of an industry show. When I think of, vendor shows that have gone that way, AWS is now reInvent as the predominant cloud computing conference. I think Cisco Networkers is a premier networking event. In fact, a lot of people ask me what happened to Interop. We're living in the heyday of networking. And what happened to Interop was Cisco Live, right? And that became a more important network show than Interop did. And I think NVIDIA's GTC is that to AI and to the rise of the GPU. They've done a nice job of growing the audience too. So, like I said, it used to be a lot of gamers and developers, but there's a lot of IT pros and CIO relevance to this as well. And for companies that are looking to understand how to reinvent their IT organization, or even IT people looking to how to up-level their skills, I think it's a good show to go to. And NVIDIA itself has broadened its product offering. So we think of them, as that silicon company. But over the last few years, primarily a GPU company, but they're in the process of buying ARM, which is a CPU company. They also bought Mellanox, which is a networking company. They bought Cumulus, which is a networking company. And so they've acquired these assets now where if you want to think about kind of next generation cloud-centric data centers, they're really the building blocks of it, right? So, I think this, like I said, the show is now very much an IT show and a major industry show. One of the areas that I like about it, in which lends the validity that it's a trade show, is their Inception Accelerator program, where I think last year they had like 300 startups actually showcasing what they could do with NVIDIA stuff. And so I'm excited that the GTC is coming back. I wish it were live, but I'm glad it's coming back. And it's always good to hear from their CEO Jensen Huang about what's on his mind. And some of the use cases some of the things they've showcased at the show in years past on their holodeck and how to collaborate, using VR and how to use, AI to even with speech analytics, video analytics, things like that has been pretty fascinating as you see some of that stuff make its way into mainstream businesses now.
Yeah. I think having an event like this is like a rite of passage for a company, isn't it? Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference, it became something larger than just about developers, right? And it seems like the same thing has happened with NVIDIA. Yeah,
actually, that's a good analogy, because you wait for WWDC to kind of understand what Apple's going to do, and that really sets the vision for the industry. And like I said, I think AWS does it with reInvent. I don't think Ignite's really got there yet, but I do think NVIDIA is there now, where we kind of wait with bated breath to see what they're going to unveil, because we always know it's going to be something big.
Well, let's talk about Microsoft Ignite. And we were talking before we started recording, and you think it's kind of more about their cloud vision in the last couple of days.
Yeah, well, they talked a lot about Teams and some of their other products and things like that. But if you watch Satch's keynote, he talked a lot about the vision of cloud and how the cloud itself is changing. Now, this is supportive of a lot of things I've written. In fact, if you go look on some of the eWEEK and some of the other sites I've written, I've talked a lot about the shift of cloud from being this centralized model. Even public, even multi-cloud is a collection of centralized clouds, right? So if I'm multi-cloud, it's 3 or 4 centralized clouds. Well, it's moving to a decentralized model that I refer to as just distributed cloud that's made up of these centralized clouds, but also a lot of edge locations, right? Now, the edge locations are fascinating because they're very ephemeral in nature. So with a product like Azure, we run our workloads on there and they're persistent. With an edge location, we might have a workload that only runs there once a month or something, or when we need it. So the clouds are now becoming a lot more ephemeral. And during his keynote, Satya talked about the fundamentals for where the cloud is headed. He talked about number one being ubiquitous and decentralized computing. And so what happens is compute's now becoming embedded into everything, into IoT devices, into edge locations. You look at a Tesla, that's a computer with wheels, right? And so, compute's being embedded everywhere, even at home with your Alexas and things like that, right? He did talk about like sovereign data and ambient intelligence. And so the more data we put in more locations, it raises data privacy issues. And so data governance has to become a bigger part of that. He did bring up an interesting point of talking about how what AI can do is code used to be written by people, but now code is being written by machines where it learns what to write from the data itself, right? And so how you manage your data, where it's stored, that's pretty interesting. It's interesting too that the big cloud providers focus primarily on primary storage, but there's a whole bunch of secondary storage out there on people's computers and things. So I'm wondering how that works its way into it. The third thing he talked about was the empowering creators and communities everywhere. So the next decade from Microsoft vision is to how you democratize creation of content and code. And so there's a lot of low code, no code companies out there now, right? So that allows just general business people like you and I to go create code where, applications and things where we couldn't before. But clearly the democratization of being able to code and create, I think helps kind of raise the world. Actually, you wind up with developers and a lot of, not even developers, but people that are able to create things in places they couldn't before. The other two weren't really cloud in nature. He talked about the importance of expanded economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce and how important the growth of cloud would be in driving career announcements. This is very similar to what Chuck Robbins talked about with Cisco and using Cisco technology to power an inclusive future. He didn't exactly, Satya didn't use those words, but it's the same kind of vision. So it's good seeing the business leaders think about that. And lastly, and this was an interesting angle for Satya to go down, where he talked about trust by design. And I thought it was a little bit, he didn't say Amazon, but I thought it was kind of a shot at Amazon, where he said companies don't want to do business with a cloud provider that sells them tech on one side and competes with them on the other side. So you think of the way Amazon works, their platform they do e-commerce on is also used. They sell that to the retailers right now. Given Amazon's AWS Cloud's revenue, I think I disagree with that. But I did think it was interesting that Nadella brought that up. So overall, I like this keynote. I did think it was a little bit me too. I didn't see anything there that was overly visionary. But I think Microsoft has kind of taken that role, right, of being a fast follower. I don't remember the last real visionary thing that came out of Microsoft, right? They were, late to cloud, but they've caught up because they're a fast follower and they're big, right? They never really got their mobile strategy in place, but they had a little bit of success because they're Microsoft. Even on the collaboration side with Teams, that's not a great product, right? But it's bundled into licenses and people use it. So I think as long as they continue to deliver kind of a basic level of where the industry is, and then can add on to that as others set the vision, that's probably okay. But I was hoping to see a little more on the vision side. But as always with Microsoft, they're a fast follower, but that seems to work.
And with their scale, they can go into a business and transform it for others.
Yeah, clearly they've got scale like none other. In fact, I'm really interested to see how they leverage the amount of data they have. I've said this for a long time, that what Google knows about you in your personal life, Mark, they know everywhere you go, every search you make. Microsoft is kind of that in the work world, right? They know what documents you write, emails you send, what applications you use, who you communicate with, things like that. So, once they rev up their AI engine, they should be able to create some pretty unique experiences. So let's see what they do.
Yeah, well, speaking of Chuck Robbins a moment ago, Cisco finally closed the Acacia acquisition.
Yeah, this one has been a long kind of chaotic journey to get here, I suppose, for them. They initially offered $70 a share for Acacia a couple of years ago, and they waited on China approval. Now China approval didn't come, although debatably it did, but there was some, I don't know, who knows what happened there. And then they wound up having to re-up their offer to $115 a share. And I know there were a few media article outlets and things that were a little critical of that. Well, they could have got it at 70, but I still think it was a good acquisition for Cisco. And my philosophy on acquisitions is always that if an acquisition is a good acquisition, you can't really ever pay too much. And if an acquisition is a bad acquisition, you can't really pay too little. So if you think of like when Cisco got into the voice over IP space, they bought a company called Celsius. And if I ask 100 people, maybe that from outside the industry, I don't think anybody remembers what they paid for Celsius, and I don't think it matters. They could have paid 10x what they paid, and it was still a great acquisition, as long as it transformed the company, right? So, I think with Acacia, it's a very technical buy because what Acacia sells is optics. Now, and historically, when you buy high-speed connectivity, 100 gig, 400 gig, things like that, you connect it with optical. In fact, 10 gig used to be all optical until a few years ago when you started being able to do copper. And so you wonder, well, what's changed there? Well, the speed of what we're looking at now at 400 gig is so high that normal optics have a hard time keeping up. And so Acacia makes this thing called coherent optics. And just at a very high level, what it does is it changes the modularity of the way the light's transferred to push through a lot more traffic, so versus your traditional optic. And so Cisco is going to be kind of Cisco architecturally has positioned their product as being a combination of hardware, software, silicon. Now at the high speed, it'll be hardware, software, silicon, optics. And so I think it was a very shrewd acquisition for them. I think if you look at any of the big service providers, cloud titans, large enterprises that are buying technology that scale, optics is always a very, very expensive part of it. Cisco can drive that price down, and I think get a pretty good competitive advantage. Acacia, obviously being an independent company, sold to more than Cisco, and Cisco has stated that they'll continue to sell to other companies, but they've made no bones about it that they can get a much better advantage if customers buy Cisco plus Acacia versus if you buy a competitive product plus Acacia. So I think it is a company that has an opportunity to help Cisco transform at the mass infrastructure side. That's an area that they haven't dominated like they had on the enterprise side, but I think this is a key component in helping them down that road.
Interesting. It's always interesting to think about the physics of optical transport and how
light, right?
Yeah, but also how minds way more brilliant than I could ever hope to be are figuring out ways around that. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, so when you think of the way optical works, it's just blinking lights that pushes data through, and so but there's a physical limit to that. And so if you change colors, right, you can push more bandwidth through, which is like what Verizon Fios is or something. But with the coherent side, if you can change the modularity of that light, now you can add even more bandwidth to it. So they're playing with kind of manipulating light to push more bandwidth through it. So you're right, it is a very fascinating scientific field, right? So
yeah. So speaking of science, a company rooted in science long ago, HPE, had a pretty decent quarter, don't you think?
Yeah, it was for them. I think it was a pretty big quarter because it's you look, HP's been in decline, and again this quarter they did have a slight decline. They finished the quarter at 6.83 billion versus 6.95 a year ago, but it was better than the street expected. Now, what I find interesting about the numbers is when you peel back the layers, most of their product areas were flat to down. So, for instance, compute was down 1%. Storage fell 5% year over year, but the big winner was what they call Intelligent Edge. So Intelligent Edge was actually up 11%, and that includes the Aruba acquisition and also the Silver Peak acquisition. And this is, I think, a sign that HP has finally figured out networking. And I think the best thing that HPE did when they acquired Aruba was they let Aruba run HPE networking. And so the last ZKast we did was with Bob Friday from Juniper. And that's a very similar story where they acquired Mist, and Mist kind of reversed, they sort of joked that they reverse acquired Juniper Enterprise. And it's the same thing where Aruba kind of reverse acquired HPE networking. And HPE networking at the time of acquisition was really a collection of older stuff from ProCurve and H3C. And so it's been completely modernized under Aruba. Aruba also has a great security story. I've often said about Aruba, they're not a networking company. They're a security company dressed up like a networking company. They have some pretty good AI components. And then they added Silver Peak on the SD-WAN side. And so they have a portfolio now from SD-WAN to data center to campus to Wi-Fi that's as broad as anybody's. And Kirti Melkoti, the GM and one of the founders of Aruba, he's really got that group humming. So it's an interesting shift for HP as a company that we think of. When I say HP, you think of computers, but this is a networking company now. And it's no surprise, we live in a network-centric world, right? Our compute's in the cloud, our devices are all mobile, right? We're connecting IoT devices, right? So we're analyzing data that crosses networks. I talked about the whole distributed cloud model. Well, that's a network. What connects all those ephemeral locations? Well, the network does. Right. And so if you're a compute vendor, I don't see how you play without being a network vendor. Like really every company's got to become that. So it sort of makes me wonder too what Dell does going forward, right? Because Dell's got a very big compute install base. They've got a decent sized network business, but again, there's no real, as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of strategy there. It's a collection of their own stuff combined with stuff they OEM, and so that's a company that when you look at all the pure plays out there, that they could do a little M&A there and become a little stronger, I think. Yeah.
Always interesting to contemplate the future of big companies like this that seem to be successful, but maybe don't have the strategy fine-tuned enough.
Yeah, well, one of the challenges the traditional compute vendors has is so much of it has moved to the cloud, right? So there are some areas like I know I was looking at the numbers this morning for HP, and one of the bright spots in the compute side was they're all flash arrays, right, on the storage side, right? So there are a few areas like that are emerging and are growing, but for the most part, with the rise of cloud computing, compute's a struggle, right? And so you do have to pivot to network. And so it took HP a long time to really become this kind of the network vendor that they are now, and it took them a couple of acquisitions. And the acquisition of Aruba wasn't cheap, but it's always been a very well-run company. And like I said, the best thing HP did with Aruba was let Aruba be Aruba.
Yeah. I remember being at EMC back in the 90s, and HP was always saying, we're going to take on storage. We're going to do storage, and we're going to do it right. And they never did. And they kind of have a history as a company, the bigger entity that has been broken up, of saying we're going to do something and never really doing it properly. And they acquire Aruba, and that seems to be the way that they're going to do networking right.
Yeah, and it's good too because they're leading with innovation. When they had the ProCurve group, that group really led on price, right? They gained a lot of share quickly, but they did it by bringing a price per port that was a quarter of where the industry was. You look at Cisco historically, and all its peers got 60, even Brocade at the high end, I think got 70% gross margins. HP Networks is running 30% gross margins, right? So you can disrupt two different ways. You can be innovative, or you can be low cost, and they chose to be low cost. And there's a very there's a very short window in which you can keep disrupting in that way. And so, but now with Aruba, they've got all the makings with between AI and security and all the stuff they're doing with mobile. And I know they're big into private 5G and things. We talked about that last week. This is the best position I've seen HP networking in well, maybe ever. Anyways, Mark, that I think brings us to the end of our time. It's always good to chat with you. There's lots of stuff going on in tech. I'm sure next week we'll have an equally busy week. So on behalf of my co-host Margaret Edwards, I'm Zias Caravella. Thanks for watching and click subscribe.